Our guest, Cary J. Griffith, grew up among the woods in Iowa and has always had a lifelong love of wild places. And he earned a Bachelor of Arts in English from the University of Iowa, and he has a Master of Arts in Library Science from the University of Minnesota. How cool that we get to learn from people like this. Griffith's books explore the natural world. In nonfiction, he covers the borderlands between civilization and wild places. And in fiction, he focuses on the ways some people use flora and fauna to commit crimes. While others with more reverence and understanding of the natural world leverage their knowledge to bring criminals to justice. He's the recipient of a Minnesota Book Award and a Midwest Book Award, which is a really big deal. So let's give him a round of applause before we learn from him.
Let me pull this out.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for coming today. Jeez, what a great audience. I was down in Duluth on Saturday and there were 7 of us. So you can appreciate how much I appreciate you guys. Thank you very much. Today, I'm going to talk about my latest nonfiction book, Blowdown in the Boundary Waters. And I just have a few questions up front. There's a reason for this. How many people here remember the blowdown of July 4th, 1999? Show of hands. Yeah, the vast majority. Of course, you guys would, because it sort of hit Ely. Not as bad as it hit the Boundary Waters, but it did hit Ely. Stopped your parade. Parade got going a little bit later, and it wasn't too bad. There are a few downed trees, as I recall. It wasn't too bad here. Nothing like what they experienced in the Boundary Waters. Second question, how many people here were in the Boundary Waters when it was hit by the blowdown? 1. No. Oh, here, Nicole. No. Devin, okay. Okay, good. I've got a couple of people here who were in the Boundary Waters. Last question. How many people are here who I interviewed for the book? Show of hands. 2? Okay. I thought I'd see another, but great. I hope I don't mispronounce your names or say anything untoward that is not in the book. You know, part of this will be, I'm going to talk probably 20 to 25 minutes and go through the slides I have about the book. I will talk about the book and then we'll open it up for questions. I have absolutely no problems answering any questions anybody has about the book, about the writing process, about any of my other books, but it would be great to hear some stories from those of you who were impacted by the blowdown or know of anybody that was impacted by the blowdown. I did this in Grand Marais. We had a great crowd last Friday, and we had a lot of interesting stories come up. So I just throw that out there. If you want to share any stories about your experiences in the blowdown, please do. This part of the presentation I call shameless self-promotion. These are my first 3 nonfiction books and my first 3 fiction books. I write about Minnesota wilderness in both nonfiction and fiction. My latest book, of course, is what we're going to talk about today, Gunflint Falling, Blowdown in the Boundary Waters, about the July 4th, 99 blowdown. This other book is coming out in June. That's the next Sam Rivers mystery. I write about a character by the name of Sam Rivers. He's a special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And it's his understanding of the plants and animals in wilderness and wilderness issues that sets him apart and makes him understand when crimes have been committed and also how to solve those crimes. Now, I was down in Grand Marais and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, you know, Mr. Griffith, when is Dead Carp going to be out? I said, dead carp, not dead carp, it's dead catch. And it happens to be about walleye poachers on Lake Vermilion and murderers. So of course, everyone here will want to get a copy. Now, when you write a book like Gunflint Falling, it is a real village project, and you have a lot of people to thank. Probably first, I would have to thank the University of Minnesota Press. They did a great job on this book. I really appreciate their help. They did a great job on the other book that I wrote, Gunflint Burning, Fire in the Boundary Waters. In particular, I'd have to single out Heather Skinner, who's the director of their PR. I'm here today in large part because of Heather, and all of the appearances and stuff that have been lined up are because of her. So special thanks to her. Probably last, but definitely not least, are the approximately 100 people I interviewed to write this book. I call out 60 in the acknowledgments, and without their generosity and their willingness to share their stories, this book would not have been possible. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to those people. Thank you very much. Now these are some pictures. This is a real interesting picture. Even though there are only 7 people in Duluth, one of them was Jim Sanders, who was the retired forest supervisor for the Superior National Forest. He was in charge of the entire Superior National Forest during the Ham Lake fire of 2007, which I write about in Gunflint Burning, but also the blowdown on July 4th, 99. He was there and he gave me this picture, and some of you may recognize, well, I don't know if you'd recognize that, but it's Ensign Lake, and it's a before and after picture, and it kind of gives you an idea of how intense the blowdown was. Now, I think about this book in 2 ways. One, I think about it as the prequel to Gunflint Burning. That's the one about the Ham Lake fire of 2007. And I think about it that way because many of the people that I interviewed for the Ham Lake fire book would tell me the reason that fire burned so hot and intense was because of all the fuel in the boundary waters from the July 4th, 99 blowdown. And then they'd proceed to tell me a story of their experience in that blowdown. And those people who were in it would tell me these dramatic, harrowing stories. And so I really became interested in it, and that's how I got onto this topic. But I also think about it as sort of a chronicle of one of the first extreme weather events that we're beginning to experience more and more of because of climate change. Back in the 80s, we started talking about climate change. Then 11 years later, from this guy's testimony was in 88, 11 years later, the blowdown happened. And there were a couple of really extreme things about that weather event. One was this was a derecho. A derecho is a straight line wind of 250 miles long or longer of 80 to 100 mile per hour winds. This was not just a derecho of 250 plus miles. It was a storm of 6,000 miles. A lot of people don't know that. This is from the National Weather Service. This shows the first 1,000 miles of the storm, which started just over the border from Fargo in North Dakota, hit northwestern Minnesota, did its most damage, that's what these black X's are, in the boundary waters in this area, and kept blowing east, sort of northeast, a little south there, went out into the Atlantic. Lots of captains of ships in the Atlantic complained about how blowy and windy and big the waves got when that came down. It went due south, went all the way down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, turned inland, tore through Alabama, tore through Mississippi, and finally 2 days later kind of burned itself out, went through the Mississippi Delta and burned itself out in the Gulf of Mexico. Huge, huge storm. Again, very unusual, and one of the reasons I think about this as a chronicle of an early, this was 25 years ago now, an early extreme weather event. Of course, we're seeing more and more of these as time goes on. This is a map. Actually, when Jim Sanders gave me the picture of that Ensign Lake, the before and after. And he also gave me this picture. I had an earlier picture. He said, you know, that picture isn't as good as another one I have. So he sent me this one, which I'm sharing. But this shows you the extent of the blowdown. And really in this area right here, the trees felled at something like 67 to 100%. Everything fell in that area. But what I try to do in this book is really tell the personal story, the human story of people that were in the blowdown. And I do that through a couple of wilderness rangers, Forest Service wilderness rangers at the time. One was Nicole Selmer. Nicole isn't here, is she? No. And Pete Weckman. Pete's not here either. Oh, Pete's here. Yes, he is. Thanks for coming, Pete. Anyway, I tell their two stories, and I do that for a couple of different reasons, but I also focus, and I'm going to give you the cliff notes of these, on camper Vicki Brockman and camper Lisa Nass. Now, one thing all these people share, this was a story about weather, right? An extreme weather event. One of the things all those people shared before they came into the boundary waters, or when they were in the boundary waters, and mind you, there were an estimated 4,000 to 10,000 people in the boundary waters at the time. They didn't know for sure. It was tough to get. They had to use wilderness permits, but wilderness permits back in '99 aren't as specific as they are today. So they guesstimated that there were 4,000 to 10,000 people. But if you had been going in the boundary waters, or you already were in the boundary waters, you wouldn't have read the forecasts for that day. But if you had, on July 4th, Pete Weckman went in on the morning of July 4th. A couple other people I write about went in that morning. Ranger John Pierce went in, who is not in the book, but I had to cut him for editorial reasons. But anyway, but just as an aside, he had a really instructive story to tell, very dramatic, and he's going to be featured in an upcoming issue of Minnesota Conservation Volunteer. If you ever go into the boundary waters and spend time there, it might be worth reading that article, because John has great advice for where to pick your campsite. If you did check the forecasts, though, a couple of asides, some things I learned, that there's 122 National Weather Service offices throughout the US, and each of them are responsible for monitoring the weather and giving the forecasts for particular regions. The one for this area is in Duluth. It's the Duluth station. The one for northwestern Minnesota is in Grand Forks. Weather in the summer always comes out of the west. I probably don't have to tell you guys that. It always comes out of the west. So the Duluth station is always interested in what's going on up at Grand Forks, what their forecasts are, you know, what they anticipate for the weather, what they're seeing for the weather right then, because they know it's eventually going to hit northeastern Minnesota. If you did read the forecasts on July 3rd, you would see here that they predicted on July 4th the weather would be warm and humid with a 30% chance of thunderstorms. Now, the headquarters of the National Weather Service is in Norman, Oklahoma, and they were actually tracking some storms that were originating in Montana and western South Dakota, but they didn't really think they were worrisome. They thought they were headed straight for northwestern and northeastern Minnesota, but they didn't think it would be a problem. So July 4th, 7:05, the Grand Forks station issues their first forecast of the day, and they still say, well, the high will be in the middle 80s. It'll be a little gusty, but otherwise not too bad. 45 minutes later, those storms that were approaching that Norman, Oklahoma, and didn't think were very worrisome, they said their character abruptly changed. They blew through Fargo and did extensive damage. And by 8:45, they issue a severe thunderstorm watch for the Bemidji area. And they predict scattered thunderstorms, some severe with large hail and damaging winds, and that's in effect until 1. Now, of course, Duluth, watching Grand Forks, they issue a revised forecast on July 4th at 10:55. And they say storms could produce hail and damaging winds. Now, I know anybody that was in Ely that day remembers that. They did produce storms and damaging wind. But now, all of those people that were in the wilderness, most of them that I write about in the book, had no idea anything like that was coming. I write about Nicole Selmer. Now, she's a little different. She actually went into the wilderness, I think on July 2nd, and she was leading a group of approximately 8 volunteers, and they were working on portages from Mudrew Lake to Foretown Lake. And I included her in the book because she was really, this is the main storm trajectory right here. She was really on the northern edge of it, but this storm did such a wide swath of damage that she was really impacted by the storm as well. Then I also tell the story that July 4th, I mentioned Pete Weckman. He started out on Moose Lake. He knew there were bad forecasts coming out, but they predicted winds, damaging hail, nothing like what actually happened. He has quite a story to tell, but he came all the way up here. And then by the time he got up to the international border, it was getting so bad that he knew he had to turn around, and he makes it back at the base on Moose Lake at the moment. Now, part of the reason I included Pete in the story is because he was in the exact center of where the storm blew right through. So he could give a really good testament to how severe the weather actually was. But I spend a fair amount of time talking about 2 particular campers. This is Jan Fiola and Vicki Brockman. Vicki Brockman was injured in this storm. Now, one of the things that I uncovered when doing research for this was, amazingly, there were 48 million trees that were felled in the blowdown. And some of those trees were huge. They were 40 inches in diameter, old growth trees, 200, 300 years old. Amazingly, no one died in the blowdown. And, the Forest Service people were braced for it when they first did their advice to people, to workers going out to do search and rescue and recovery. They said, okay, you're going to find bodies. When you do, you have to rope them off, call in the sheriff. They had a whole series of instructions for people, and they continued those instructions for 7 to 10 days. Incredibly, they didn't find anybody, but there were people that were injured, and I cover a couple of them. One of them is this Vicki Brockman right here. Jan Fiola, unfortunately, she passed away in 2002, so I couldn't interview her, but I interviewed Vicki, and Vicki came in. Vicki and Jan had been in the Boundary Waters before. They did a very familiar Boundary Waters route from the Gunflint side. This is a real popular route. And they had met Sue Ann Martinson at a party someplace, and they got to talking, and Jan and Vicki said, hey, they've learned that Sue Ann, who was 55, had never been in the Boundary Waters before. And so they said, hey, why don't you come on our trip? It'll be great. We'll have great time. We'll have a great time. And it turns out Jan was a gourmet cook. And so Jan was going to take care of all the food. Vicki was bringing the boxed wine. It was going to be a really nice trip. And their plan was they were going to drive up to the end of the trail campground at the end of the Gunflint Trail on July 1st. On July 2nd, They were going to go to the Whale Wilderness Outfitters, get their canoe and all their stuff that they needed, paddle in that first day, July 2nd, up into Saginaw, all the way around. And they end up camping on an island on the southwest side of Saginaw Lake that day. This, as I mentioned before, is a real popular route because you can do it in 2 or 3 days and it's very close to the edge of the boundary waters. They end up camping on that island that night. It's beautiful. They have hammocks, they're readers, they have one of Jan's gourmet meals. The next day they wake up July 3rd and they paddle through Red Rock Lake. Jan and Vicky are showing Sue Ann places that they had camped before. They come into Alpine Lake and they want to go to a particular campsite that they know of. And their plan, of course, is to go into Alpine Lake and score this campsite and stay there the evening of July 3rd, all day July 4th, and finally portage out on the main portage from Alpine into Seagull. That locals call that the Alpine Highway, because that's the one that everybody uses. It's really wide, it's clear, it's the most easily traversed. They were going to portage out on July 5th, paddle up to the end of the Seagull and pick up Jan's car and then go home. That was the plan. Now, one other thing here, this map shows this portage right here. This is the Alpine River. It's another way to get in and out. Most people don't use it because the river is really swampy. It's usually low. Most people don't use that portage. They use the longer Alpine Highway portage. Not, is it? Yeah. There you go. Thank you. Okay. Now I talk about another camper, Lisa Noss, who was injured. And she went into the Boundary Waters with 4 friends, and they did it very similar to the way Vicki Brockman did. They, on the first and second, Ray and Michelle Oreo, they went in to score the campsite. They camped in this is kind of south central. You get up there by going up the Sawbill Trail and you take back roads and you come to this campsite, Kawishua Entry Point 37. They camped there the first, and the plan was they'd portage all the way into their desired campsite up on Lake Polly. They did that. They got their campsite on the second. Ray was really happy it wasn't there. I should back up. One of the differences between Lake Polly and Alpine Lake were the number of campsites. Lake Polly, as you might have seen all those dots, that lake is very popular. It's very close to the edge of the boundary water, so it has a lot of campsites. Lake Polly, not so much, and that becomes important later on. When they come in, they score that campsite, and then on July 3rd, that's Saturday, Sunday is July 4th. On July 3rd, they're joined by their other 3 friends, Lisa Noss and the Schwendingers, Mark and Christina Schwendinger. And, they have a great time, again, because they're relatively close. It took them about 4 hours to portage into here to go through these portages. And because they're so close, they've been able to pack in spaghetti and meatballs and, again, boxed wine. I think Lisa brought in some vodka that she mixed with, dehydrated lemonade or whatever. Kind of thing I'm sure you all do when you go into the boundary waters. Anyway, on the 3rd, they all get up there in the afternoon. They have this fabulous meal. And then both of these groups, now these Vicki Brockman is probably 10 miles almost due north of where Lisa Noss is. Now remember, the storm had a swath of 5 to 6 miles wide and 30 to 40 miles long. So while Vicky was almost right on Alpine Lake, was almost right in the center of it. Lisa was further south on the edge of it, but there were a lot of microbursts on the outside perimeter. Again, back to where Nicole Selmer was. A lot of the trees were still standing where Nicole Selmer was and Lisa Noss were, but a lot of them were falling down too. Unfortunately, well, on Sunday, July 4th, Vicky and her friends wake up and it is hot and it is still. And the lake is like polished steel. It's just really hot. And so they do the same thing that Lisa Noss and her friends do. They get into the lake. They take some dips. They try to stay cool. And about 11 o'clock, they notice the skies to the west start changing. Now, Vicky and her friends can't see it as well as Lisa and her friends because they have a campsite that looks due west. But they're looking out there and they see the storm, the clouds start turning this ugly shade of green and purple. And then, pretty soon by 11:30, the skies start the breeze picks up. It starts raining a little bit. Sure enough, by probably 11:45, 11:50, Vicky and her two companions take refuge in their tent. Suddenly, the skies open up. The winds really start howling. Trees start falling. There's thunder and lightning. Their tent collapses around them. There's three of them huddled in the tent. Vicky Brockman is actually really worried because she's hearing trees start to fall around them. And so she gets in kind of a fetal position and she covers her head like this. And the tree, sure enough, falls right on her hip. She takes probably however thick that tree is, probably 20 inches. That falls right on her hip. Jan Fiola is on one side of her and Sue Ann is on the other side. Sue Ann gets pinned to the ground with branches from that tree. Vicky is completely pinned and Jan Fiola is able to wiggle out. She cannot move the tree and she calls to some people that she knew were camping across the way. Remember, Alpine had a lot of campsites. Most of them were filled. She calls out to those people, a couple guys come over and help her get the tree off. But one thing they realize is that there is no way they can portage out with Vicky Brockman. I mean, it turns out that her pelvis was shattered in 13 places. She could not move. So there's no way they could portage her out. And by this time, anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about, she's stuck. But throughout the day, there's Alpine is hit so hard that you can imagine. I mean, what would you do if you were in a ruined wilderness? Even though it was the 4th of July, you'd try to get out. And there was a mass exodus out of all those Alpine sites. Now, remember, their campsite was right across from the Alpine Highway, the main portage area. That main portage area became covered with about 10 feet of fallen trees. It was impassable. So people had to paddle up back around that peninsula and take that little Alpine River. Normally, the Alpine River is like a swamp. Because of all the rain, it's now kind of a juggernaut and the easiest way to get from from Alpine Lake to Seagull Lake. Now, what happens is everybody that tries to get out that day goes by their campsite because they think they're going to go to the Alpine Highway. Jan and Sue Ann, who are up and ambulatory, tell all these people, you've got to tell the Forest Service they need to send in a plane. There's no way we're going to get Vicky out of here. She needs to be flown out. Sure enough, eventually word gets out. So over in Lisa Noss's campsite, it's a little bit different. Lisa had rented this canoe from Sawbill Outfitters, and it was a solo canoe. It was really lightweight. It was a Kevlar. I think it was 55 pounds. And in the height of the storm, all 5 of them are huddled behind a tarp. And Lisa looks around the tarp and sees that the wind is howling and her canoe is starting to get picked up by the wind, and she's afraid it's going to blow away. And so she runs out to try and secure it. And when she's down there, this tree breaks off and grazes her in the head, knocks her out, and she's unconscious. It was a big enough tree that if it would have hit her directly on the head, it would have crushed her skull. That's how hard it fell on her. And she, like Vicky, was in a world of hurt. They knew once she became semi-conscious, there was no way they could portage her out. Unlike Alpine Lake, they had a problem. There weren't a lot of people passing by. There wasn't anybody to really go out and inform the authorities they needed to medevac out Lisa. So the Schwendingers, hustled out portages that they had crossed the previous day in 4 hours. They did in 2. Got out and got in their car. Got enough. There was some cell phone coverage at the time. They found a high point in that campground. They were able to call out, and they actually, I think the guy they talked to was Chip Elkins, who's was a law enforcement officer for the Superior National Forest at the time. Chip got word out, and sure enough, they were both eventually flown to safety. This is Vicky getting help on a gurney, getting help to get into a beaver plane, and that was Lisa Nass's campsite. She goes out. Now, truth, I have to say, is I write fiction. Truth is stranger than fiction because I didn't know this when I started interviewing Lisa and interviewing Vicki Brockman about their different experiences. But at some point in that whole process, I come to find out that they were both flown here to Ely. They both went to the hospital and they were both examined by the same doctor. And the doctor told both of them the same thing. Your injuries are too bad. We can't do anything for you here. We have to send you down to the Trauma 1 Center in Duluth. They both end up in the same ambulance that night. Vicki Brockman, of course, she has a shattered pelvis, but she is coherent. She's got some painkillers, but she knows what's going on. And when I talked to Vicki Brockman about it, she said, boy, I don't know who was in that ambulance with me, but they were in a world of hurt. And they really were. She was in and out of consciousness. They make it to Duluth. Vicki is examined and they tell her there isn't really anything they can do for her except she needs to remain calm and as still as possible for 7 to 10 days and let her bones naturally heal. And that's what she does. And she does make a full recovery. Lisa, by the time she got there, they were afraid she was going to die because of her brain swelling up so much. So they had to open up her skull a little bit and relieve pressure on her brain. But she makes a full recovery too. Now, this is another map that the Forest Service put out. And I like this map because it shows you not only the intense area of blowdown, all this red where it fell, where all the trees fell, but it also shows you into Canada. And there was a lot of damage that happened in Canada too. In fact, the Boundary Waters didn't have any fatalities, but Canada did from the blowdown. That's how bad it was. By the numbers, it happened from approximately noon to 2 o'clock. It flattened the BWCA 40 miles long, 5 to 10 miles wide. It felled 48 million trees, damaged almost 500,000 acres. At its peak, mostly organized from right here in Ely, but also from the Gunflint side, there were 310 people working on search and rescue and recovery. And it cost in those first 2 weeks almost $1 million. Okay. This is the time if you have any questions at all, let me know. Or if you have any personal stories or personal anecdotes to add, let me know. Yes.
Got a mic for you, Elton. Hang on.
Her story of riding up from Duluth and after church would be interesting. But later, years later, I heard the story about a Boy Scout leader who a few days before the storm had Boy Scouts cut his leg with an axe. And they were starting to get infected, and getting him out was really dicey. And that's why I ended up calling on him in the Duluth hospital for a long time before he was able to be well enough to recover enough to be able to go home to Texas. Did you ever hear that story?
That sounds familiar. I didn't interview the guy, and I don't remember that specifically, but I do. There was another group of scouts that were flown out with Vicky Brockman that the scout had broken his collarbone.
So
But-
way up, we stopped for Subway sandwich in 2 hours.
Sorry.
That's when the storm came through. So we start up to Route 2 and about, I don't know, 10, 15 miles up. There's trees across the road. There's a lineup of cars going north. And there's a guy who pulls his chainsaw in the back of his pickup truck and is working. Finally, cleared enough. We go on to the next bunch of trees down. Anyway, it turns out there's all these guys with chainsaws in their pickup truck. And so we did a side trip at Sand Lake, and that had already been cleared, and then finally got the Ely to our place over here. And that night, there was the windstorm, but that night there was a thunderstorm. And I thought all those people out there with wrecked tents now getting rained on, right? But out of our closing window, we had a 3-story light show. With the lightning up top. This late day storm. There was the Ely fireworks. See across here, and down below there was the fireflies. It was very cool.
Thank you, Elton.
You know, it's funny that story about the chainsaw. Jim Winnanen, who went up the Gunflint Trail, he was the director of the Wilderness Canoe Base. I write about him in the book. And he had enough sense. He was down in Grand Marais when it blew down, and they didn't know anything happened in up at the end of the Gunflint Trail because it kind of blew that northeast, right? And so when he got word, he thought, well, what the hell's going on? Well, I better take a chainsaw. So he took a chainsaw up, and that was by the time he hit Trail Center, which is halfway up the trail. By the time he hit that, he talked to the deputy and said, hey, the deputy said, well, no, we're not letting anybody up there. And he said, yeah, but I got a chainsaw. Okay, come on up. It was your ticket to moving throughout there.
I don't have any personal involvement with the fire, but July 4th. I remember I'm from northern Michigan, southern Michigan, northern Indiana. I was going to visit family, and so as I drove out, going towards Indiana, I was just amazed by the sky and the conditions. It wasn't windy, yet it was early. You mentioned green, it looked yellow to me. Just eerie kind of weather. Yeah, I mean, I've lived up there forever. But then the other end of the story, so I knew nothing about this. I grew up in Indiana, and but I'm get up early in the morning and I read the paper every morning. And so the news in the paper in South Bend, I believe, probably paper, was a Boy Scout troop, and he had pictures of the thing that ordeal they went through to get out. And so I don't know, you must have come across that kind of thing all over the place, because we are at the end of the road and all these people were going home to somewhere. The details I don't remember, but I was just amazed by the fact that that's what was happening when I left. The stories they had to tell.
Yeah, you know, if it would have happened today, we would have had videos, we would have had pictures, we would have had tons of stuff. One of the things the press didn't want to do was duplicate any of the photos I had, because the photos, of course, were taken by those old Instamatics, so the resolution was terrible. But if it would have happened, and a lot of people even in Ely didn't know what happened in the boundary waters. Most of the people in Grand Marais didn't know what happened in the boundary waters. And they didn't for a day or two afterwards, but because it took so long for word to get out. Go ahead, Becky.
My husband and I were hiking the Bass Lake Trail that day. And I noticed that when you had your storm damage, you picked up the Trout Lake unit, this Forest Service maps saying damage in the boundary waters. There's a big gap between the Trout Lake unit and where the wilderness picks up. And the storm didn't just jump over that gap. Many of us who live in the forest in that spot between the Trout Lake unit and where the wilderness picks up by Moose Lake were also impacted. So it should have been, in a real world, a lot of red in that area. We got home before the worst of the storm hit, and many of you who lived in the forest probably experienced this as well. But we stood in our cabin and watched the big pine trees in front of our cabin just actually swirling around in a circle. It was very dramatic. And we heard pretty quickly, actually, about where the worst of the storm was, and where it touched down on Moose Lake and damaged the whole south shore of Moose Lake heading north. I went on a canoe trip later that summer, quite a little trip, but came out through Fort Town and Mudrow. And still weeks after the blowdown, the portages were almost impassable. The task of cleaning those portages took a long time. So many of us felt the effects of the blowdown quite a time later. The Forest Service then did this massive EIS to deal with the blowdown, and millions of trees were blown down. But we're still seeing the Forest Service today working to deal with the effects of the blowdown. And the Fernbird project, if you look at it, which includes proposed prescribed burning in the wilderness, is still trying to deal with the impacts of that blowdown. So it lives on in terms of impact on the ecosystem, and the Forest Service manage those impacts.
Yeah, a lot of the Forest Service people that I interviewed, a couple of them in particular said, little did I know that day when I was going out to help people, that this storm would occupy me for the next decade. They were just so busy doing search and rescue and recovery. They brought in all sorts of people. Another thing Jim Sanders told us was that one of the questions was asked, why didn't they go into the boundary waters and harvest those trees? And, it's a wilderness area, right? So it doesn't have any roads or anything like that. Amazingly, Jim allowed, he worked with everybody involved, and they signed an interim regulation that allowed chainsaws to be used in the boundary waters for cleanup and rescue and recovery for a short period of time. But then he also mentioned that in order to harvest all those things, you'd need to build roads in there to get the trees out. And by the time they would get these roads fixed, the logs would not be harvestable. They would not be usable. It doesn't take long for them to begin to spoil. They look good to you and I, but they aren't fit for pulp or lumber. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't clear them all out. Yes.
Over, because we're all like, well, why didn't you just walk over? He goes, no, you have no idea. It wasn't to step over the tree. It was impassable. And same thing about a lot in the power tools. Every year after that, if anyone would complain about a fallen log on the trail, he'd be like, you have no idea what it was like in this one. This is nothing. This is easy to do. But yeah, very scary. They didn't know when they could get out and couldn't get a hold of anyone. And I don't think anyone got injured, but yeah, it's very, very scary.
Yeah, and dangerous cleaning those up. Even to do it with manual tools, a lot of them were spring loaded. So if you cut one down, it could spring up and it could kill people. Peter Lashak was telling me a story where he was cutting and something just like that happened. He was in the boundary waters right after the blowdown with a chainsaw, and he severed something in a tree, came right down and just stopped short of smashing him in the chest. And stuff like that. I heard a lot of stories like that. Pete probably has stories like that.
Out at Sand Lake on Highway 2, County Road 2, 30 miles from Ely, and the storm came really, really fast. My golden retriever ran under the bed, first time in her life that she'd ever done that. And the sky started turning green. Anyway, a little bit later, a couple of neighbors and I were trying to clear Highway 2. It was about 10 feet deep with trees and very few ways to get through, but there happened to be a deputy, a Lake County deputy in the area, and he came upon us and begged for a chainsaw. I ran a log building school there. I always kept my chainsaws full of gas and ready to go, and we were using. So he borrowed a couple of chainsaws. He said there was a report of a woman with a tree on her legs north of there somewhere. So we cleared a path for him. I don't know how we did it. But, we got through mostly going in the ditch. What a mess.
Wow. Can we get a show of hands again of the people who were in the blowdown or who were involved in the aftermath? Other questions, comments? Oh, yep, see. All right, we'll go over here first and we'll come back, Cindy. You had a hand raised before.
Well, I did, but then he mentioned it, the loggers, some were asked and said, we can't get that stuff. The way it's all in a big mess, and some of the logs are busted, they're not gonna be good for timber.
Yep.
And they're too dangerous if they even get in there. I was at home sleeping, had relatives that left town, and I was awoken, it sounded like a train. I'm in the second story of my old house, and the windows crackling and everything, And I looked outside, and there was a big beach toy that we must have had, and it was plastered against my neighbor's house. And I said, something's going on.
Astute.
Two years after another year, 2016, we had a smaller blowdown in going most sites in the school area. Not sure if it was quite as intense. It was 60 to 100% destruction, but it sure was quite a blowdown on a smaller scale. It makes me wonder, from management or ecology, did you come across any references to other blowdowns historically? Probably hard thing to look at, but is this, you made the claim, and you're probably correct that this is a harbinger of climate change, but we've always presumed we had crazy weather. Are there other blowdowns that we have evidence of? And just as an aside, Peggy and I were caught in the 2016 blowdown. I'll say more about that if you're interested, but
Sure. Was it a big area that was where it hit for that?
The 2016.
Yeah, the 2016.
Well, it came across Basswood Lake and towards Moose Lake, but I think it was perhaps less an impact in part because it had already been blown down once before. But we have vast extensive mature forest throughout the boundary water with the log over, but yeah, it was definitely small.
Yeah, those aren't that unusual. I think they call them microbursts, where they will come down and they'll hit it. They're different than a derecho, though. A derecho, has to be 250 miles long of 80 to 100 mile per hour winds. But there are those. But when I researched derechos, which are those longer, more intense storms, they almost always happen in the middle of summer, but further south. you know, southern Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri. Not up here, but you do get bursts. Those do happen, you know, periodically.
The event we were in years back, my tree was called a mini blowdown. I think the winds were recorded at 90 pounds. 5 was a ratio. It was scary effect.
Oh, I bet.
And
Oh.
Seeing your stories of those.
Yeah. Were you do you remember the campsite? Were you on an eastern shore or a western shore?
We were, well, people here probably know, we were camped on Basswood Lake. We've gone up by motorboat. And south of Washington Island, there's a campsite, I think some of the locals refer to it as Grand Island, called Island in the Middle. And it was very similar weather conditions. Late July, hot as heck, still, and so we were with some friends. We set up 2 tents. They picked their site, and Peg and I picked the island. Kind of probably rises 20, 30 feet above the lake on one side, facing to the west. We put our tent right on the edge there, hoping maybe we get a little bit of breeze. And we went to bed, you know, on top of our bags. It was just too hot to sleep. And that storm hit in the middle of the night, 2, 3 in the morning, as I recall. And, you know, first we hear the distant thunder and it's kind of rolling and getting closer. And then our tent starts flapping and it's getting wet. And then our tent just went flattened on my side of the tent. And I kind of crawled over towards Peg, already kind of soaking wet. And the whole tent came down. And all we hear is the freight train noise outside. You know, we have no idea what's going on. It's blowing, it's thunder, it's lightning. And we had to abandon our tent, crawled into our friend Doug and Christine's tent, which was foolish, but they had room, and we waited it out, slept for a few hours before dawn, woke up, and that island, there were trees flattened all around. One similar, it was just seeing yours was kind of like bringing back PTSD. Describing that woman who had her hip injured. There was a 18, 20-inch Norwood pine that just laid down parallel to the tent, 3 feet away from the side of the tent. And could have taken care of all of that.
So you were in the trees and you were were you facing west?
Our tent was on the west edge of the island. We could, yeah, just hit us.
Well, and the reason I ask is because John Pierce, that's his advice. If you go into the boundary waters in the summer, find an eastern facing or an eastern campsite that faces west. Then counterintuitively, the winds come out of the west, go into the winds and get down to the shoreline. You won't be killed by fallen trees. You'll be inundated by terrible rain and everything else, but you won't be killed by fallen trees.
Right.
Good advice.
I remember Eric was in the woods that 2016 trip. It was very stressful. I like to be ignorant of these things. Yeah.
One hears about animals having a second sense and just exiting. And I'm wondering how many animals, I haven't heard anything about animals being killed, or did their sixth sense or second sense or whatever get them out of the area, or just what?
You know, it's interesting. You know, I've been asked that at every one of these appearances. And I think that's a really valid question. You know, it's a human conceit. We're only worried about the humans. But yes, you know, it was really interesting. A guy gave a present. I did a presentation to the Friends of the Boundary Waters, and a guy shared his stories, and he said one of the things he noticed on the day he was in the Boundary Waters on July 4th is he saw more moose than he had ever seen. Now, it might have been just that they were so hot that they were trying to get to the water's edge, but it might have been that they knew something was coming, and so they were getting to the safety of a lake, right? An open area away from fallen trees. Another story that I was told that's actually in the book is a couple of horses, Jim Tim Norman's, he was a forest management officer, but a volunteer firefighter in Tofty. And they have a big 4th of July parade like you guys do. And that got canceled part of the way, but his daughter had a horse and her friend had a horse and they wanted to use their horses in that holiday parade. Well, they did do the horses in the parade, and then kind of they got a southern angle part of the storm that came through later that night. Later that night, it rained 17 inches in Tofty, closed down Highway 61. But Tim thinks that those horses knew something was going on, because after the parade, he and his daughter could not get those horses back into the, the trailer to have them trailered up to their paddock. They just wouldn't go. They were just so skittish. So I think, some of the animals did. The other thing Pete Weckman told me was that when he was coming back down from Moose Lake, after the blowdown, he was completely hemmed in, but he had a boat that was serviceable. So he went up to start to try and help people. And I recount this in the book. But on the way back, he's coming back in the dark. And he's going through one of those narrows that comes into Moose, I think, from one lake to another. And he looks up and he's completely lost, because the tree line, the thing that you would use in the dark or at sunset to guide you, was completely gone. Moreover, one of the huge white pines in that little peninsula there that he was going through had a huge eagle's nest in it. And the pine was down, the eagle's nest was down. I'm sure many animals perished in that thing, but I don't have any direct research that I can cite.
All right, we'll do our last question or comment, Mr. Boyles.
Well, we weren't affected too much by the 99 because we were out of Lake Vermilion at our cabin was where our property was. We were in the Twin Cities, but we came up there. There was a huge white pine down in front of our cabin, and we cleared brush for days, even though we were supposedly not in the line of fire. And later we camped up on Pine, Trout Lake, and saw the damage there. And then later we moved to Moose Lake, where it had hit there. And I'm surprised that one hasn't gotten more attention, because there was a loss of life there. By the time we were able to get up to, it was 2016. By the time we got up to the northern tier just to check on them, we got trapped by a helicopter coming down to take bodies out. And Johnny Hyde, who was up in the Basswood at the time, and she was kneeling on a life jacket just to stay out of the line of lightning. But she was on the same island where a tree came down and killed some people. And also the other thing about that is it took a tree down in front of our home there, and we had to crawl out through the branches. But it went all the way to all the way down to Fernburg, and you can still see that today. Into Wisconsin.
Yes, but you could say one thing about 2016. Cary will give you a link.
2016, probably remember, was when Dave and Amy Freeman were spending their year in the wilderness. And Harry Smith, who's the CBS guy, came to Ely to paddle into the Boundary Waters to interview Dave and Amy. They spent the night before at my cabin, and that was the blowdown night. So when we got up the next morning to venture into the Boundary Waters to find Dave and Amy, first we had to get trees cut out of our road, trees cut off the Passy Road, trees cut off the Echo Trail. Paul Shirky, who was coming with us, had to completely clean up the Sunset Road, get crews out to cut trees so he could make his way in. We ultimately, Nancy Paredes was with us. I don't know if Nancy's still here, but Nancy, Paul, and I paddled Harry Smith in that day And as we went into the wilderness, we were coming out across people who were, who had been traumatized by the blowdown. It was really a big deal, up here. I lost more trees in 16 than I did in 99. And, we ultimately found Dave and Amy. They were on Birch Lake, I think it was, or Carp Lake. I can't remember where they were, but, a tree had come down right next to their canoe, did not damage their canoe. And they had a lovely interview with Harry Smith in the wilderness the day after the blowdown. And how many here saw Dave and Amy interviewed by Harry Smith on TV? Any of you? One? You gotta go get that so we can all see Dave and Amy on CBS.
Well, Cindy, I realized you raised your hand and I missed it. We'll get you next time. It's time for folks to go purchase books and get signatures from our guest author here today, Mr. Cary J. Griffith. Reminder, there is no Tuesday group next week, so I'm going to miss you, but I will see you in March. Thank you very much.
Thank you.